Tonight, the fallout from Friday. President Trump pointing fingers, well, just about everywhere, except it is at himself. How did the healthcare debacle happen, and what happens next? President Trump, he's opening the door now to working with Democrats, but will they be willing to work with him, and on what? Also, now Jared Kushner, he's got to answer questions about contact with the Russians during the campaign, and that's not the only controversy the president's son-in-law is right in the middle of. Good evening, everybody, and welcome to RFL. All that and a lot more, including issues closer to home. I'm Richard French, and thank you for joining us this Monday night. Well, you remember this?
We're going to start winning again. We're going to win so much. We're going to win at every level. We're going to win with healthcare. We're going to win so much, you may even get tired of winning. And you'll say, please, please, it's too much winning. We can't take it anymore.
Yeah, okay. I don't think he was talking about the Democrats. Today is the day for the White House to regroup that after Friday's stunning healthcare defeat. Now, that also follows yet another turbulent weekend. When aren't there, right? I don't think he was talking about Democrats or the Freedom Caucus. They both came out winners in this debacle if you look at it. Now, there's real questions about where this goes from here and an uncertain future. President Trump now looking to lay blame. That after his first major legislative defeat, he's blasting conservatives, tweeting, Democrats are smiling in D.C. that the Freedom Caucus, with the help of Club for Growth and Heritage, have saved Planned Parenthood and Obamacare. But the chair of the Freedom Caucus, unapologetic.
Well, I mean, at this particular point, I can tell you no one has been more self-critiquing than me.
The president and fellow Republicans say they're now looking to turn the page to their next big challenge, tax reform, also signaling they may be ready to reach across the aisle.
I think it's time for our folks to come together, and I also think it's time to potentially get a few moderate Democrats on board as well.
But will Democrats get on board?
He moved so far the hard right that it's virtually impossible for us to work with him. If he changes, he could have a different presidency.
The blame game comes after a weekend of clashes at pro-Trump rallies around the country. Protesters and Trump supporters coming to blows, as the president seemed to be in his own battle with Republican House Speaker Paul Ryan, with his head-scratching tweet saying, "Watch Judge Jeanine on Fox News Saturday night." Those who tuned in, they saw Judge Jeanine Pirro open her show with an explosive hit on Ryan.
Paul Ryan needs to step down as Speaker of the House. The reason? He failed to deliver the votes on his health care bill.
But the White House claims the timing just a coincidence, and Paul Ryan has the president's full support.
He doesn't blame Paul Ryan. In fact, he thought Paul Ryan worked really hard. He enjoys his relationship with Paul Ryan, thinks that Paul Ryan's a great Speaker of the House.
Now, the blame game, it does continue. And bear in mind, the bill, it wasn't just pulled once, but 2 days in a row, votes were scheduled, then canceled. And here is how, at least for one, the Times describes the aftermath. Quote, on Friday evening, a somewhat shell-shocked President Trump retreated to the White House residence to grieve and to assign blame. In a search for scapegoats, he asked his advisors repeatedly, whose fault was this? Increasingly, that blame, it has fallen on Reince Priebus, the White House Chief of Staff, who coordinated initial legislative strategy on the health care bill with Mr. Ryan, his close friend and fellow Wisconsinite. And President Trump also reportedly upset with one Jared Kushner. He is one of the president's most trusted advisors, by the way, a son-in-law, but he was off skiing in Aspen during the most pivotal time in the young Trump presidency. And Times columnist Maureen Dowd, she had a scathing column about the president yesterday, and I just want to read you a small portion of it. Quote, you're all about flashy marketing, so you didn't notice that the bill was junk, so lame that even Republicans skittered away. You were humiliated right out of the chute by the establishment guys who hooked you into their agenda, a massive transfer of wealth to rich people, and drew you away from your own. You sold yourself as a businessman who could shake things up and make Washington work again. Instead, you got worked over by the Republican leadership and the business community who set you up to do their bidding. Ouch. Let's bring in our panel right now. Janine Zaino, she is a professor of political science at Iona College, also a senior advisor at the consulting firm Applied Techonomics. Dominic Carter, political journalist and author, of course. Mercury senior vice president Daryl Isherwood, and Andrew Whitman, our senior political correspondent. All right, a ton to unpack here, but we start with Jeannie, just where he is right now. His approval rating, you know polls as well as anyone, at 36%. Give people an idea right now. Nobody's at 36% in the first 100 days, and he hasn't had some international scandal or a huge incident to deal with here. All this stuff's been of his own making.
All of it's been of its own making, and in fact, you look at an approval rating like that, and you're nearing a basement level, really, because you can't get, he shouldn't get much lower than 36. And he's got an awful lot ahead that he wants to get done and wants to do. And the big question now is, can he do any of these things he wants to do with the political capital he's spent on this health care bill? You know, I think it's, you know, I wasn't surprised, by the way, about the Janine Pirro Twitter, because I think that's what I've been saying all along. He's going to blame Democrats, but then, of course, he's going to blame Republicans in the House leadership who took him down this garden path. And this wasn't even a bill that, by the way, he talked about embracing at all initially, and it didn't include the principles that he talked about. So the fact that he rushed in to embrace it and they lost in the way that they did, it makes it more difficult for him to go back next time, even with issues like tax reform and immigration
Absolutely.
and infrastructure, that he should have a better shot at
and
accomplishing.
we're going to talk about what's next, but also there's the math part of it is he needed the savings from healthcare to help pay for some of these projects. And Daryl, as you say, all politics local. We bring it closer to home, and you know New Jersey inside out. I thought it was real interesting. The Lobiondos, the Lances, Republicans, conservative Republicans were standing away from this thing because they had a feeling just how bad it could get. And unbelievably, it was political malpractice of the worst order. Either somebody couldn't count votes, but they managed to make it worse from Thursday to Friday. They had the Freedom Caucus, who I don't know why they were surprised, weren't going to go along to get along, but then they started losing moderates too. I mean, what a hot mess.
Yeah, it's kind of ridiculous at this point that they let it get to the level that it got, where it's just now a complete embarrassment. What I find interesting is in the clip you showed before, they said Republicans will now start reaching out to Democrats, you know, and it's like, well, good plan, you know, but what's amazing about that is they hold both houses of Congress, you know, and they need to find Democrats for their coalition.
Apparently, when President Trump, he was going to go public, he was already going to blame the Democrats. Even his aides were like, I don't think that's going to work.
Yeah, that doesn't sound like the right plan.
It didn't stop him. But, and if you learned anything from last week, because remember, the whole ramp-up was the president's a closer. He knows how to get things done. He's the author of The Art of the Deal and everything else. Sure, we can assign who were losers. There were plenty of them to pick at. But to me, it also was, you saw vulnerability. You saw that for people who didn't know him from New York, like we did all, covering him over the years, that it maybe was a lot of smoke and mirrors in a lot of cases. Some people who drank the Kool-Aid were shocked that he wasn't able to close this thing.
He was an absentee landlord on this thing. I cannot recall in my entire life a president asking about the failure of his own agenda. Whose fault is this? First of all, that means you're not particularly invested because you would know whose fault it is. If there was somebody who's blamed to be assigned, because you're involved in quarterbacking this thing. The fact that he didn't have a clue whose fault it was gives you some idea that he wasn't invested in the process and that it's his fault. He didn't know the details by most accounts, didn't particularly care what was in the bill, didn't have a real strong hand in crafting the bill. He simply wanted to get it passed so he could check off the accomplishment and take whatever savings, according to at least what Paul Ryan told him, and move that on to tax cuts, at least something he cares a little bit more about. Now, I don't know how much of that will get through to Trump voters in particularly red states, but I think for that middle group of voters, maybe the reluctant Trump voter who just didn't like Hillary, that's a pretty big demerit.
You know, Tom, sometimes I think people make too much of optics, little stories here and there. But there were two things that I mentioned that were mind-boggling to me. One of the closest advisors and people within the White House is the guy with all the different warring factions between the Bannon folks and the Priebus folks. Kushner at least can get him to listen to a degree. You're off skiing in Aspen for the week? For the healthcare vote? I mean, for the last 7 years, your party has said this is the most important thing. It helped get him elected. Repeal, forget what you're going to replace. We're going to repeal the thing and you're going to do something. The guy was MIA. And then on top of this, I know today, Sean Spicer said, it was just pure coincidence. He's a fan of the Piro show. And she leads after he teases, tune in.
Trust me, it's not a coincidence.
Ryan should be out on his keister. I mean, you talk about, palace intrigue and who's in charge. I mean, my gosh, right?
Well, let's start with the son-in-law. This clearly points to there's trouble in paradise between dad and son-in-law. We don't know how bad it is. Maybe it's just a little bit. Maybe Mr. Kushner was just upset and he's like, I'm out. I'm going skiing, whatever, with my wife. I don't know where the wife was, but it points to trouble in paradise. As to what actually happened, we spent the day today, Richard, on the phone with some congressional Democrats, their offices. Nobody wanted to comment on the record. But it's not. If you think that they're going to cooperate with Trump and be part of this coalition, I got a bridge.
For sale,
I got a bridge that I can say. It's not going to happen. There's a reason. Okay, I just want to rewind for a little bit. Rahm Emanuel, the current mayor of Chicago, was called everything but a child of God as the chief of staff to Obama. But you've got to have a good cop. Obama was the good cop, and you got to have the bad cop. Rahm Emanuel was the guy if you mess with this president, you will only have one more term in Congress because I'm going to make sure you're not around. This President Trump, he's walking around singing and dancing about I can close the deal, but he's got nobody to enforce the deal, and he don't even know the details of what's going on. This is a nightmare. And it's not, I don't see this lasting much longer.
And that's a perfect segue, though, because it was a bad week. But the question is, can he turn it around? Healthcare shelved for now. By the way, I don't think it's for good. I think both parties are going to want to come back to this in the not that distant future. But nonetheless, it won't be what's next. We're going to talk about that in terms of agendas and, as Dominic said, what he's hearing from Democrats as to whether or not they see the guy on your screen as somebody that they can deal with or even want to. All that and much more after this.